Hi, I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, philosopher and historian. Today I want to talk to you about Thomas Jefferson's moral sense. And I'm going to be drawing plentifully from my book, The Scholar's Thomas Jefferson. I highly recommend this. It's a bit pricey, but it's well worth the price because it's organized into four different parts. The first part talks about Jefferson's political philosophy and his political theorizing. The second part is organized to cover Jefferson's thoughts on morality and religion. And the third part covers Jefferson's educational philosophy. The last part, Thomas Jefferson, Collectania, which reads like an encyclopedia, and I cover various aspects that are philosophically illuminating vis-a-vis the mind of Thomas Jefferson. So the first draw from a letter to his young daughter at the time, Martha Jefferson, in 1783, early in December. She's concerned that the world is going to come to an end, and so Thomas writes to her to assuage her fears, and he says, as to preparation for that event, i.e. the end of the world, the best way is for you to be always prepared for it. The only way to be so is never to do nor say a bad thing. If ever you're about to say anything amiss or do anything wrong, consider beforehand. You will feel something within you which will tell you it is wrong and ought not to be said or done. This is your conscience, and be sure to obey it. Our Maker has given us all this faithful internal monitor, and if you always obey it, you will always be prepared for the end of the world, or for a much more certain event, which is death. So what that tells us, I'm going to put the light on here because it's starting to get a little dark. It's a feeling. It's something he tells in a letter, a 1786 letter to Maria Causeway, that might be located in the heart. But it's a faculty. It's a feeling that you have. It has nothing to do with rationality. In 1785, years later, 2 years later, he writes to his nephew Peter Carr, who is for all intents and purposes, his son at the time, because his father, Dabney, has perished. And, and Peter is a young man now, and it's time to give him some fatherly advice. He says, give up money, give up fame, give up science, give the earth itself and all it contains rather than do an immoral act. And never suppose that in any possible situation or in any circumstances that it is best for you to do a dishonorable thing, however slightly so it may appear to you. Whenever you are to do a thing, though it can never be known but to yourself, ask yourself how you would act were all the world looking at you, and act accordingly. So it's an internal monitor, and if you're distraught in terms of say between two courses of action, which is the right course, it's not a matter of thinking through it. Just pretend that everybody in the world could watch you, what you're about to do, could see the effects of your choice, and he says in that case you will choose the right course of action, right? So he doesn't talk about this at all as paired with the rational faculty, as some people think, And this is, again, something that's very important to discover, because Thomas Jefferson's thoughts on morality are seldom disclosed or discussed by historians, and mainly because historians are not properly trained to deal with his philosophical thought. But anyways, in that 1786 letter to Maria Causeway, this is this big love letter to which I refer before in other episodes, and he talks about reason in the moral sense and the different habitations. He says, and Jefferson just jumped on the couch, sit down, bud. When nature assigned us the same habitation, she gave us over it a divided empire. To you she allotted the field of science, to me that of morals. When the circle is to be squared, or the orbit of a comet to be traced, when the arch of greatest strength, of the solid of least resistance to be investigated, you take the problem, it is yours. Nature has given me no cognizance of it. In a like manner, in denying to you the feelings of sympathy, of benevolence, of gratitude, of justice, of love, of friendship, she has excluded you from their control. To these she has adapted the mechanisms of the heart, Morals were too essential to the happiness of man to be risks on the uncertain combinations of the head. She laid their foundation, therefore, in sentiment, not in science. She gave to all as necessary to all, this only to a few as sufficing for a few. Not, in other words, rationality is given to a few, like Galileo, Boyle, Aristotle, Hume, and others. But the moral sense everybody has, with some slight exceptions, just like people sometimes are born without eyesight. So it's a faculty. Now you notice he talks about the the empire of science, right? Squaring the circle, mathematical, the orbit of the comet, mathematical, the arch of the greatest strengths, mathematical, solid of least resistance, mathematical. These are all sorts of problems that do not engage most people throughout the course of a day. In other words, just about all actions that we are going to do on a daily basis have some moral content to them. But when reason alone is investigating something, this is the area when we're dealing with mathematical items. So, I mean, it's the different habitations, as it were, that he calls them, different empires. So we get in another later letter to Peter Carr, August 10, 1787, he tells Carr not to attend lectures in this branch. He says, he who made us, in other words, God, would have been a pitiful bungler if he had made the rules of our conduct a matter of science. So they're not a matter of rationality. For one man of science, there are thousands who are not. Again, a sort of elucidation that rationality is not evenly given to all people. What would have become of them? Man was destined for society. His morality, therefore, was to be formed to this object. He was endowed with a sense of right or wrong merely relative to this, to his society, in other words. This sense is much a part of his nature as the sense of hearing, seeing, feeling. It's a sensory faculty. It's the true foundation of morality and not the truth, etc., as fanciful writers have imagined. It has nothing to do with rationality. The moral sense or conscience is as much of a part of man as his leg or arm. It is given to all human beings in a stronger or weaker degree, as force of members is given to them in greater or lesser degree. It may be strengthened by exercise, as may any particular limb of the body. This sense is submitted indeed to some degree to the guidance of reason, but as a small stock which is required for this, even a less one than what we call common sense. State a moral case to a plowman, farmer, or a professor. The former will decide it well and often better than the latter, because he has not been led astray by artificial rules. What he means by that, that's why he enjoins his nephew not to take courses in morality, because there's no instruction to be had when it comes to moral decision making. We feel our way through them, and everybody knows right or wrong at birth, at some sense. So he says the moral sense faculty can be strengthened through exercise. It's sort of like working your bicep out, your tricep or bicep, working your pecs, working out a limb, straining a limb. And by that he doesn't mean that we can't make moral decisions. I think what he's saying is that we need to be incentivized to do moral correct action. We often know the right thing to do, but we are too habitudinous to do it. We're too lazy. We just decide not to. Maybe giving a pint of blood is the right thing to do, but then I have to lose some blood. I have to drive to the donation center and so forth, and I don't want to go through all that trouble. So it is given to all. It's not a matter of rationality. And he says, all right, it's a small stock of reason. So what does he mean by a small stock? It sometimes requires the help of reason. And I think that follows when he talks about how the right thing to do in one society for one culture may not be the right thing to do in another society or another culture. And that has led Gene Yarbrough and Adrian Koch and a lot of other people to say that the moral sense is entirely relative. What is morally right in one culture, which Jefferson says is not morally right in another. Now, how are we to take that literally? It seems to be there's no real right or wrong, and I think that's the wrong way to take that. I think what Jefferson is arguing is that there is a right and wrong. Some cultures, like civilizations that are deficient, say Native American cultures, might not have their moral sense refined sufficiently well, refined through habit or training, right? There could be moral retardation. Jefferson allows for that. And so we need to be cautious here when we're concerned with the moral sense. So the notion of moral relativism as moral arbitrariness is, I think we can dispel with that. I think Jefferson thinks that as we advance rationally, we're also going to advance morally in the morality that he advocates is our duties to God and our duties to other human beings. And he says that quite clearly, that's what morality entails. So we need to fulfill both of those things to be fully morally engaged. I want to turn to a very, very important letter to Thomas Law, June 13, 1814. Again, I'm drawing from my book. He says, it shows how necessary was the care of the Creator in making the moral principle so much a part of our Constitution that no errors of reasoning or of speculation might lead us astray from its observance and practice. In other words, we have a sense for the right thing to do, and no course of rationality is going to pull us from our understanding what the right thing to do. It could pull us. It could tell us not to do the right thing, right? But rationality is unneeded for us to come to an understanding of what that is. This is all the theories on that question. And I don't want to get to. He says the thief who steals your guinea does wrong only inasmuch as he acts a lie in using your guinea as if it were his own. Truth is certainly a branch of morality and a very important one to society, but presented as its foundation as it is, as if a tree taken by the roots, right, had its stem reversed in the air and one of the branches planted in the ground. Truth is not the foundation of morality. It is a branch. So morality is something that comes on the ground, and truth is just one of the branches of morality. He says, some have made love of God as the foundation of morality. This too is but a branch of our moral duties, which are generally divided, and this is important, into duties to God and duties to man. So we have to be fully moral creatures. We have our duties to God and duties to man. And I'm going to say something that's important. If we did a good act merely from the love of God in a belief that is pleasing to him, whence arises the morality of the atheist? It is idle to say, as some do, that no such being exists. So he talks of here, it's a very confusing passage that I've cleared up. Arthur Scher, who's a friend of mine, thinks that that there's genuinely, because Jefferson says moral atheist, there's something called a person who doesn't believe in God who's genuinely an atheist. But that can't be what Jefferson means here, because he's clear that to be fully moral, we have our duties to God and to duties to man, to be fully, functionally moral. In which case, what do we get out of, why is he talking about the moral atheist? Well, he's not talking about an atheist being moral. He's talking about an atheist acting materially or as if he were moral. In other words, two people can be presented in the same situation and behave identically, right? Identically. And in other words, they could their behavior from the perch of someone who might be judging their morality intentions is identical. I just do the right thing. But the one person might do it for the wrong reason, right? In other words, if I do the right thing and I do it for consideration of other human beings, but I don't have my duties to God and love of God, I'm not fully moral. I'm behaving morally, but to behave morally is not the same thing as to be moral. There's a difference. So I have to have both. I have to have a love of God and engagement and love, engagement with duties to other people. So he says, so love of God is not, foundational. Truth is not foundational. He says the to kalon of others is founded in a different faculty, that of taste, the sense of beauty. He says we can't talk of beauty being a branch of morality because the beautiful is part of our aesthetic sense, which is a separate sensory faculty. So for Jefferson, we have reason, a separate faculty linked with the brain. We have morality, presumably tells Maria Cosby, linked with the heart, and then we have our sense of beauty. And he doesn't talk about where that is located. If that is, if morality is literally linked with the organ of the heart, he doesn't say anything about beauty, what beauty is linked with. And then he talks about self-love as a fourth candidate. Therefore, is no part of morality. It's exactly its counterpart. It's the sole antagonist of virtue, leading us constantly by our propensities to self-gratification in violation of our moral duty to others, right? It's an enemy of virtue, okay? Self-love can't be, as some philosophers argued, the justification for our moral activities. Jefferson thinks our moral activities are guided by benevolence, guided by the principles of Christ, of loving other people, loving God, and using those two things, love of God and love of others, as the foundation for morality. He talks about moral activity giving us pleasure. He says, but how happens it that they give us pleasure? Because nature hath implanted in our breasts a love of others, a sense of duty to them, a moral instinct, in short, which prompts us irresistibly to feel and to succor their distresses in protest against the language of Helvetius. What other motive than self-interest could determine a man to general actions? It is as impossible for him to love what is good for the sake of good as to love evil for the sake of evil. And again, this bungling artist, he says, the Creator indeed would have been a bungling artist if he had intended man for a social animal without planting in him social dispositions. And he says, of course, they're not planted in every man. And he does acknowledge that there are morally defective people. And these are physically defective people as well, because he's a complete physicalist. But he would argue later on that, proof that not everybody has a moral sense is Napoleon. Napoleon had no sense of right or wrong. He says the want or imperfection of the moral sense in some men, like the imperfection of the senses of sight or hearing in others, is no proof that it is not a general characteristic of a species. When it is wanting, we endeavor to supply the defect by education, by appeals to reason and calculation, by presenting to the being so happily conformed with other motives to do good, to eschew evil, such as love or the hatred or rejection among those whom he lives, and whose society is necessary to his happiness and even existence. Demonstrations by sound calculations that honesty promotes interest in the long run, the rewards and penalties established by the laws, and ultimately the prospects of a future state of retribution for the evil as well as the good done here. These are the correctives which are supplied by education and which exercise the functions of the moralist, the preacher, and the legislator. People have misconstrued this passage for the longest time. Jefferson is not saying that we are motivated to do the right thing by reason, by incentives, by the promise of heaven, or the worry, the concern of perdition, of Hades. What they miss is Jefferson, all this follows right after he talks about possibility of not having a moral sense. What Jefferson is simply saying, in those creatures who lack a moral sense, we can make up for that, presumably, by education. In other words, we can take people who are not going to be able to feel what is right or wrong and incentivize them through the use of reason. Here, reason can help here. I can teach them how to, through rational persuasion, how to behave the right way, even if they'll never be the right way. Now, one thing I can say is that Jefferson, in a letter to John Adams, talks about, and here we get a little bit of a sticky problem. He talks about there being, he talks about humans being given by their creator the moral sense, something similar, he says in that letter to Adams, that other social creatures have, and he's referring to bees and penguins and ants and all sorts of creatures who have a sense of social instinct. And that has created for me problems for the longest time because, it suggested to me that humans aren't really unique with respect to their moral sense. And, I didn't know what to do with that. And I've been able to create, to eradicate, sit down, Jeff, eradicate the confusion because Jefferson talks about, so in other words, the problem is this: bees can have a moral sense, right? Humans have a moral sense. So humans aren't really unique with respect to their moral sense. They're not privileged animals in the cosmos in that regard. Well, one could argue that that's not quite right because even if there are other social creatures, bees, ants, puffins, penguins, and other animals, like cattle, that have a certain sense of social instinct. So humans may not be unique, but they do have. Each human has some amount of rationality that other animals don't have. So there's that uniqueness. But there is something, and I'll end with this, that is unique to the human moral sense. And the human moral sense for puffins, for penguins, for cattle, they behave as morally sensitive creatures when they behave with respect to other creatures like themselves in the way that their animal nature tells them to behave, right? Cooperatively, working for the good of each other. But it seems unlikely for me that any of those other creatures have a sense of God. That Jefferson is clear in certain letters to Adams is that when we talk about God, unlike David Hume, I know God exists, Hume says, because I can look at the magnificence of the cosmos and see it's an ordered structure, behaving according to laws, and from then I draw via analogy, which is a rational thing. The cosmos itself, the law of gravity, the law of falling bodies, Boyle's law, and other such laws. It's a rational fact. It is a law-governed, nomological universe, cosmos. So there must be a creator God. So David Hume argues via analogy through analogical reasoning that we can access God that way, and that's rational. Jefferson doesn't say that. We access Jefferson's God entirely through feeling. He says to Adams, I feel, therefore I exist, and so forth. And he goes on to understand through feeling the existence of God. He says, I look up to the heavens, I feel a perception of divine. It doesn't say I reason through and argue via analogy. I feel the presence of God. So humans are unique in the cosmos, in a sense, that their their moral sense faculty requires them for an action to be done from a sense of moral duty. It requires them to do it from a sense that it's the right thing to do, of a love of other human beings, but also from a duty and a love of God. And that does make humans creatures that are unique in the cosmos for Jefferson. Well, I hope you like this. And again, I really encourage you to get this book. It's wonderful, perhaps the best collection of essays on Thomas Jefferson, organized not just chronologically, but organized neatly into 4 different sections. I think you'll like it. So it's put out by Cambridge Scholars Press. I think it's something like $70-something, but it's It's a collection of essays that you'll put to good use and you'll enjoy for the rest of your life. TTFN, ta-ta for now, and we'll do this again. Thank you, and good night.